the chronology of chronological relationship in the book of Revelation. And last year we had Dr. John McLean present a view that I personally didn't fully agree with, but I wanted someone else to present a view different from what I held to see if I could be persuaded and others. I thought it was on. It's on now. I think it's a background noise myself. But nevertheless, we wanted Robbie to present a paper from the perspective, at least that I agree with, and I think many people agree with. That is that the consecutive fulfillment of the seal, trumpet, and bowl judgments, and the fact that the seal, and trumpet judgments are fulfilled in the first half of the tribulation because of the chronological nature of the book of Revelation. And I'd especially like to hear, after he presents his material, from any of y'all that might disagree or have questions, because this is a complicated area. And it's something, when you first start studying the book of Revelation, you're probably not real comfortable being dogmatic on any position on this. But it's something that does take a while to get familiar with the text and look at all the different points. So Robbie's going to be doing that. And Dr. Dean is pastor of West Houston Bible Church. He and I were classmates at Dallas Seminary. I knew him back before he was a famous, well-educated person. And he was pretty much the same back then as he is now.
Uneducated,
right?
Undisciplined.
Yes, all of the impulsive, but you just got to have the right impulses. If you're an impulsive person, make sure you have the right impulses. But nevertheless, so he has been teaching the book of Revelation for the last 4 or 5 years, more in depth than even a person at a seminary or university would usually teach it. So he's been immersed for the last 4 or 5 years in the text of Revelation. So I'm happy for him to come and present this presentation on the chronology of the book of Revelation. Thank you, Dr. Dean.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ice. I remember Dr. Ice back when he was quiet and unassuming. No, now I'm out of fellowship because I've been lying. From Tommy's introduction, though, I take a couple of points. Number one is that there are those of you who may disagree with the position that Tommy and I hold. Well, first of all, the reason I've been invited is just because I agree with Tommy and he wanted somebody else to, express his opinions. But he was smart enough to say there are some of you who will disagree. This is a difficult area. When I started off, first time I ever taught through the book of Revelation many years ago, I basically taught through Dr. Walbert's commentary because I just didn't know anything else. And over the years, like most of you, as you get into the text and you study the broader range of eschatological issues, you begin to refine, think things through, raise questions, answer questions, raise more questions. And so I have held different views as I've gone through, but over the last 5 years, I've been teaching. I'm now on my 214th or 215th lesson in Revelation. So I've been teaching that at my church, which has allowed me to dig the post holes kind of deep. So those of you who don't agree with things that I say, I invite you to raise the questions so that we can understand them, and Dr. Ice will answer those questions. And those of you who agree with me and want to compliment me, then you, of course, are free to do so. All right, we are looking at the book of Revelation now. Just another little word of introduction. Oh, I have a guy in my church who came up with these, and last year some people didn't get them. These are little lapel pins of the rapture. Don't turn them upside down, unless you're an atheist. But they go like this, and it's just a couple of arrows indicating the rapture, so they'll be around, and I'll set those down here, and people can grab those and wear those to create some questions. People say, why do you have those arrows on your lapel? All right, well, we're going to look at an important topic. It's important not because it's going to change your marriage or improve your finances or give you insight into investment strategies, but if you are a teacher of the book of Revelation, if you are a teacher of prophecy, then if you are teaching this prophetic word, then you have assumed some sort of chronological framework within the book of Revelation. And anyone you read, whether it's Dr. LaHaye or Dr. Ice or Dr. Heinsohn or Dr. Thomas, they have embedded within their writings an understanding of the chronology within the book of Revelation. Yet they don't agree. Dispensationalists do not necessarily agree with one another because this is a difficult thing to deal with. There are not real hard and fast passages that you can go to, so you have to scratch below the surface and dig a lot in order to understand these things. In the book of Revelation, there are basically three key elements that your chronology has to go around, and those are the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowl judgments. I believe these are all chronological and they are sequential. Those issues are really handled by other people, other places. Dr. McLean's paper did a fine job with that last year. Dr. Thomas, in his 2-volume commentary on Revelation, has done a fine job of dealing with that particular issue. So I am assuming, as almost all dispensationalists do, that the judgments in the book of Revelation are sequential and and telescopic, so that seal 1 through 7 follow one after the other. The 7th one opens up and reveals the trumpet judgments. The 7 trumpet judgments are sequential. The 7th trumpet judgment opens up and reveals the 7 bowl or vial judgments. This is a common understanding. However, we still need to work as dispensationalists in understanding how we're going to organize, and we see the Scripture organizing these judgments, especially in relation to the chronology of Daniel's 70th week. As you read the commentaries, there are basically three chronologies that emerge. The first is that of Dr. Walvoord, and Dr. Walvoord is truly unique in his position. I know of no one else who takes his position, and his view is that the judgments that are covered in Revelation chapter 6 through 19 all fall within the last half of the tribulation, often referred to as the Great Tribulation. In the Bible Knowledge Commentary, Dr. Walvoord writes, most expositors assume that the events beginning in Revelation 6 cover the whole 7-year period. The book of Revelation, however, never uses a 7-year figure, but frequently refers to the 3.5 years or 42 months, because the events of chapter 6 and afterwards seem to coincide with the Great Tribulation rather than with the time of peace in the first half of the 7 years. There are good reasons for concluding that these great events are compacted in the last 3.5 years before Christ's return to the earth, certainly at least by the 4th seal. The events described anticipate a time of unprecedented trouble. That is Dr. Walvoord's view. I'll interact with it a little bit as we go through the paper. The second view looks something like this. This view, which is the view that was presented by Dr. McLean last year, this is the view Dr. Thomas holds in his 2-volume commentary on Revelation. A number of you may hold this view, and that is that the first half of the first half of Daniel's 70th week is the period of the 7 seal judgments. The Abomination of Desolation comes at the midpoint of the tribulation, approximately at the time of the 6th seal judgment, so that the 7 trumpet judgments and the 7 bowl judgments then come in the second half of the tribulation period. Then there is the third view, which is the view that was canonized in the Tim LaHaye Prophecy Study Bible. Which I'm being paid well to support and promote here this morning. This is where the seal judgments and the trumpet judgments come in the first half of the tribulation. Then we have the abomination of desolation, and the bowl judgments come in the second half. Now, as I was teaching through this last year, I thought, well, that really spreads out the bowl judgments. It seems that they come rather rapidly once they begin. And I realized that there's a verse that is often overlooked, and that's Revelation 10:4, where the seven thunders are to be sealed up. And so there has to be some time for those seven thunders to take place. And so probably a better rendition of this would look something like the chart you see before you, where we have the seven thunders coming after the abomination of desolation, as well as the seven bowl judgments. Now, to arrive at the conclusions that we must in order to assume a chronology, we have to address several key questions. First, when do the seal judgments take place? Are they in the first half or the second half? Second, when are the 144,000 of Israel, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes, when are they sealed? Or is that during the period of the seal judgments, or between the sixth and seventh seal, which would put their sealing somewhere near the middle of the tribulation period? Third, who are the martyred multitude of Revelation 7:9 through 17? Are these the martyred of the fifth seal judgment, or are they the martyred of the entire 7-year period? You have to understand and figure out the chronological relationship of chapter 7 to the preceding and following chapters. Next are the two witnesses prophesying in the first or second half. This is a key issue, defining this. And a couple of years ago, Dr. Whitcomb presented an excellent paper just in time for when I was about to approach that subject in my teaching of Revelation, and I really benefited a lot from his work. The two witnesses in the first or second half, and then finally, though the abomination of desolation is not specifically mentioned in Revelation, are there clues that allow us to connect this event with an event that is described in the Apocalypse? Now, in order to understand the chronology of Revelation 4 through 19 and the reasons for the development the way it is, we have to do three basic things in any study. The first is to make sure we understand Daniel 9:24 to 27. I'm only going to touch on that briefly. Understand the basic structure and flow of Daniel's prophecy, especially in regard to Daniel's 70th week. Second, we need to fit the general framework of Daniel's 70th week there to Matthew chapter 24 and the Olivet Discourse. And then from those anchor points in Daniel 9 and Matthew 24, we then can understand the structure of the chronological structure of the tribulation in Revelation 4 through 19. I believe, after my study of Revelation, as many of you do, that it pulls together all of the loose threads of unfulfilled prophecy that we find in the Old Testament and a few in the New Testament, so that without an understanding of what's in the major and minor prophets and a few things that are in the Gospels, you really can't put together what's happening in the book of Revelation. So the first thing we have to do is take a look at Daniel's 70th week. Daniel's 70th week begins with the coming prince signing a peace treaty, ends with the Messiah's return. The midpoint is the third tribulation temple, so it is divided into these 2 3.5-year periods. A lot of people think the Daniel 70th week begins with the rapture, but it does not. It begins with the signing of the 7-year covenant between the prince who is to come and the many. Daniel 9:27 says that he will confirm a covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Now, this verse gives us some key chronological markers for understanding the structure, at least, the framework of Daniel's 70th week. We see that it is a 7-year period, and that the phrase in the second stanza there, the second clause, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, so that at the midpoint of the tribulation, it assumes that sacrifices and offerings are being offered regularly in the temple in Jerusalem, and that those are brought to an end by an abomination, a word that's often, frequently, normally associated with idolatry in the Old Testament. So there's going to be an introduction of idolatry at that time. That's inferred by that word abomination. And then we learn that this period is going to end at what is referred to as the consummation, which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So that ends with the return of Jesus Christ. So we have the two halves of the tribulation period, 3.5 years each, 1,260 days each, 42 months each. Now that does get into another question that Dr. Walbert assumed, which was that those terms are all equivalent and they all refer to the second half of the tribulation. I'm not sure that has been adequately established. So the end point of the tribulation comes at a complete destruction, and the Lord Jesus Christ returns. He defeats the Antichrist, the first beast, the false prophet, and the dragon. Regarding the 70th week, Dr. Fruchtenbaum writes in his excellent work on Footsteps, furthermore, it states that the covenant is made with many, not with all, but with many. The Hebrew text uses a definite article meaning the many, the many. This is the leadership of Israel that will be empowered to sign covenants of this nature. The covenant is made for 1/7. On one hand, it begins the 7 years of the tribulation, but on the other hand, it is also signed for the specific purpose of being in effect for 7 years. So that gives us that chronological marker. So we see that from all of these statements that we have a good handle on how long the tribulation period lasts. Regarding the chronological framework, Arnold writes, the last 7 is a total of 7 years and is the same 7 years as the Great Tribulation. These 7 years, the 70th 7, are subdivided in this verse into 2 equal halves of 3.5 years each. Elsewhere in Daniel and in Revelation, they are given different descriptive terms. Each half is referred to in 3 different ways. Sometimes as 1,260 days in Revelation 12:6, sometimes as 42 months, Revelation 11:2-3 and 13:5, and sometimes as a time times and a half a time, Daniel 7:25. In all cases, they are equal to 2 3.5-year periods comprising the 7-year period. So, having established the framework, which is that 7-year period, we then have to look at key chronological indicators within the text. The first comes in Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6 gives the unfolding of the 6 seal judgments, one after the other. It's clear from the structure that they are chronological, they are sequential, and there is a parallel between Revelation chapter 6 and statements made regarding the end time, Daniel 70th week in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, three key passages in the synoptics. And the chart you see up on the screen shows how each of these areas talks about the same basic categories of plagues or judgments, false Christs, wars, international instability, famines, pestilences, persecutions, and martyrdom, earthquakes, and then cosmic phenomena. And so as you look at those, you see that there is a parallel between those that Jesus warned of that would take place as what he referred to as the beginning of birth pangs in Matthew 24:8. Labor pain imagery was frequently used to convey the suffering related to the approach of the day of the Lord and those judgments, and distinguishes these events from similar trends that precede Daniel's 70th week. There are those, and I'm sure out in the audience, there are those of you who believe that when Jesus is speaking in this part of Matthew where he's talking about there will be wars and rumors of wars and famines and pestilences, etc., that refers to general trends that take place during the church age. However, I would suggest that because of the nature of the question, what is the sign of your coming, that Jesus is talking about things that will signify his return. Normal wars, famines, and diseases do not signify anything special. He is talking specifically about something that will occur that will be different. So I think that the wars, famines, pestilences that he speaks of here are significant. They are sign events that indicate that Daniel's 70th week has come. So since he is answering that specific question, it seems unlikely that he would be referring to just general historical trends of nature. How else would these be signs if there was not something unique about them? Only after he describes these signs does Jesus then immediately speak of the desecration of the holy place in the temple in Matthew 24:15 through 16, and the subsequent flight of the Jews into the wilderness. Matthew 24:15, Jesus says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Now, what we learn from Daniel chapter 9 is that at the time of the abomination, there is a cessation of sacrifices and offerings. What we learn from Jesus' statement here in Matthew 24:15 is that it will also involve something that will stand or take its place in the holy place, which is the inner sanctum of the temple, not the entire temple precinct, but the holy place that was comprised of the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and the holy place. So in light of this, Jesus is giving us some chronological indicators, and it seems to me that this, when you look at the passage this way, and you do not take a historicist interpretation of the wars and rumors of wars and famines and judgments, but you place them as future signs within Daniel's 70th week, that this pretty much does away with Dr. Walvard's approach, which would put the seal judgments in the second half. This would indicate that the seal judgments, at least, I think the trumpet judgments are there. They're not mentioned at all in Matthew 24, either before or after the Matthew 24:15. So they can easily go in the period of the first half without doing any violation to the text. Now, when we get into the next chapter, that's Revelation chapter 6, when we get into the next chapter, the events of Revelation 7, we have to answer the question, when are the 144,000 sealed? There are two key things that occur in Revelation chapter 7. The first half of the chapter focuses on the sealing of 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the second half focuses on a group of martyrs that are in heaven that have come out of the Great Tribulation. And so there's two groups of people there that, and the relationship, the chronological relationship of chapter 7 needs to be examined in light of chapter 6. It's clear that the seal judgments are sequential, but what about the flow from chapter 6 to chapter 7? Now, as I've stated, one view places the sealing of the 144,000 at the beginning of Daniel's 70th week, or during the period of the seal judgments. A second view, this is the view that usually goes along with the view that puts the trumpet judgments in the second half. A second view places the salvation of the 144,000 after the seal judgments, but before the trumpet judgments. This would place their sealing in the second half, or the midpoint to the second half of Daniel's 70th week, very late in the tribulation period. The view that places the trumpet judgments in the second half of Daniel's 70th week places the abomination of desolation between the sixth and seventh seal. In this view, the sealing of the 144,000 is subsequent to the sixth seal, but before the seventh seal is opened. To support this view, those who take this position argue that Revelation 7:1 through 3 is seen to indicate that the events of chapter 7 come only after the events of chapter 6. The four angels holding back the four winds are commanded to not release the winds, so that neither the earth, nor the sea, nor any tree be harmed. Since the land, seas, and trees are not harmed until the first three trumpet judgments, Revelation 8, 7 to 11, a pause occurs between the sixth and seventh seal to allow for the sealing of the 144,000 in that view. That would place it close to the end. Now, yeah. I don't leave it up all the time. If you notice, people just zone out on an image, and halfway through morning you're going to go to sleep, so I don't want you to look at me and not get hypnotized by my pictures. You all have to be entertained, I know. Okay, here's a chart. The top half represents the view that the trumpet judgments are in the second half and that the 144,000 are sealed after or subsequent to the 6 consecutive seal judgments. So you have the seal judgments, and then there's a pause as the angels are held back the judgments. Then the 144,000 are sealed, and then you have the trumpet judgments coming in the second half. The chart below the line represents the view that the seal and trumpet judgments are in the first half. In this view, the 6 consecutive seal judgments take place and are described in chapter 6. And then the 144,000 are sealed, and they are responsible for the salvation of many during the tribulation period. Remember, after the rapture, there are no believers left on the earth. This position argues that the 144,000 are saved. They then are responsible as evangelists for the saving of multitudes, directly or indirectly, during the first half of the tribulation period, so that by the time you get to the 5th seal, where there are multitudes of martyrs, there has to have been someone there who instrumental in evangelism. So this view would also identify the martyrs of the second half of Revelation 7 with the martyrs of the 5th seal, and this would have the 6 seal judgments and the 6 trumpet judgments in the first half. Looking at if you look at the text, it seems as if those who put the sealing after or subsequent to the seal judgments have a point. I think that's only superficially true. The seal judgments, in their view, appear to be summarized in Matthew 24, 4 through 14. Nothing is mentioned in those verses that's unique to the trumpet judgments, and so it's assumed that those trumpet judgments come after the midpoint of the tribulation. Further, in their view, the events associated with the holding back of the winds in 7:1 seem to fit not the previous seal judgments, but the next series of trumpet judgments. So in their view, as Dr. McLean puts it in his paper, Revelation 7 is a preview. In my view, it follows a Semitic pattern, just as you have in Genesis chapter 1, where you have the consecutive 6 days of creation, and then you go to chapter 2, where Moses comes back and gives us a detailed analysis of what happens on the 6th day. I believe that is standard Semitic prose, and what we have in Revelation is Revelation 6 gives us those 6 seal judgments, comparable to the 6 days, and then you come back in chapter 7, and it hones in on 2 specific events that take place within the chronology of Revelation chapter 6. Now, this is substantiated. I have a couple of quotes here to look at from Dr. Fruchtenbaum. The key phrases are after these things. I think there was a typo in there on one of these where I had the passage listed wrong, but we begin with verse 1. After these things, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree. Then I saw another angel. Now, these chronological markers indicate how things are presented to him, not necessarily how they unfold within the chronology of the tribulation period. It's like watching a television show where the camera shifts from scene to scene, and those scenes can also be taking place simultaneously. Dr. Fruchtenbaum writes in his book on Footsteps of Jesus, Footsteps of the Messiah, this passage describes the third of the 5 events happening throughout the first half of the tribulation. This ministry of the 144,000 is something that occurs throughout the entire first half and not merely after the sixth seal judgment. In fact, it is going on during the seal judgments, and it is the means by which the fifth seal saints come to the Messiah. The passage begins with after this, which is not chronological, but merely the next vision that John sees. The same thing will be said related to 7:9. After these things is the next thing that he sees, not that the events in 7:9 and following occur chronologically after the events of 7:1 through 8. So after these things, John writes in the latter part, I looked and behold a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Just a tremendous view of the magnificent grace of God within the tribulation period, of a large number of people who will be saved. They are not all under judgment and condemnation. Now, related to the 144,000, we learn from Revelation chapter 14, verse 4, that was a typo. I think I had 12:1 inadvertently at the beginning of that paragraph. It should be 14:4. The 144,000 are designated as first fruits in Revelation 14:4. So if they are the first fruits of Jewish believers within the tribulation, then it seems to me rather unlikely that their salvation and sealing would come after the six seal judgments are complete, or at the time of the sixth seal judgment, and would come, which would be close to the middle of the tribulation. In that view, you've got almost 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week go by before you start seeing Jewish converts, and you start having, and the 144,000 are sealed. Second, you have a question that is raised at the end of chapter 6 from the earth dwellers as they are encountering the sixth seal, and that there's asteroids and whatever falling from heaven, and they hide in the mountains, and they say, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come, and who is able to stand? John, I believe, uses that phrase, sets it up at the end of the book to answer it in chapter 7. Who is able to survive the intensity of the sixth seal judgment? Well, the answer is those who are mentioned in chapter 7. You have the 144,000 who were sealed, and you also have the Christian martyrs that survived during this particular period. Thomas writes, the interlude that follows immediately answers the question of a panic-stricken world. Now remember, Thomas puts the chapter 7 subsequent to chapter 6, which is not the view I'm taking, but he recognizes the importance of this same question. The interlude that follows immediately answers the question of a panic-stricken world who will be able to stand in 6:17. Revelation 7, 1 through 8 answers in essence the 144,000 servants of God will be able to stand. It pulls back for a moment and visualizes a group of saints on earth who are on God's side and consequently have God's seal of protection from the wrath yet to come. Not just the wrath yet to come, but it seems from both his view and others that it protects them from at least the sixth seal. Well, to be protected from at least the sixth seal, they have to have been sealed prior to that. So it seems, I question the chronology there in their view, how they're consistent. If the 144,000 are sealed before the sixth seal, then why do you have to place all of that so late in the tribulation, within the tribulation period? Now, in the next section, I deal with the argument that's presented. This was Dr. McLean's argument from Luke. He states in his paper very clearly that he thinks that the passages in Luke 21 and 23 are the real key to understanding chronology when you place them together with Jesus' statements in Matthew and Mark in the Olivet Discourse. In Luke 21:20, Jesus says, and only Luke records this, and this is the only place where Jesus is actually answering the question of about when will the temple be destroyed. The other aspects of Luke 21 are answering the question, what are the signs of your coming? But this is the only section that answers the question, when is the temple going to be destroyed? And so Jesus says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation, the Greek word there indicates destruction, is near. And that seems to indicate what happened in 70 AD, not what happens at the second coming. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. See, that is what happened in 70, but that's not what happens at the end of the tribulation period. The Lord is going to return and rescue and deliver them. They will not be taken captive into all the nations. Jerusalem will, he says then, Jerusalem will be trampled. The key word there is pateo, which is the same word picked up and used in Revelation chapter 11, 1 and 2. Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So the starting point is they're being led away captive, and it continues until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So here I have a chart that graphically portrays these time periods. In the timeline at the top, we have the crucifixion, approximately AD 30, 33. We have the destruction of the temple, the second temple in AD 70. Then in the midpoint of the tribulation, then the second advent, and then on into the millennial kingdom. In 21:20 to 24, Jesus is talking about the days of vengeance. This is when Israel is judged, and that focuses on the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Then you have the beginning, or not the beginning, but the continuation, because I believe the times of the Gentiles started back in 586. But the times of the Gentiles continue, and Israel is scattered throughout all of the nations until God begins to bring them back to the land, first in unbelief and then in belief, up to the time of the second coming. And then verses 25 to 28 shift to a forward event that goes back to talking about the end times period. Jesus says, look up, your redemption draws near. This looks at the salvation of the Jews at the end of the tribulation period. So Luke 21:20 to 24 comes in the middle of a discussion about what happens during Daniel's 70th week, but it focuses not on the end times, but on what happens in 70 AD. The other passage that Dr. McLean focused on was Luke 23:29 and 30. And you have the same discussion of women who are pregnant and wishing they weren't and didn't have infants at this time of judgment. What he does is he tries to string all these passages that use this verbiage, this imagery, together as if they must all necessarily refer to the same thing. So Luke 23:29, Jesus said, the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. So this is taken, Luke 23:30 is taken then to be equivalent to the sixth seal judgment, when the same scripture is quoted from the Old Testament. And yet most people take, well, nearly everybody, I can't find anybody who takes Luke 20:21 to refer to anything other than 80-70. And it's so sad how many people are just so general when they come to commentaries. I looked at 10 commentaries, and all they said about Luke 23:29 is Jesus talking about how such a bad time is going to come, or something in just vague terms, and they don't even try to identify it as a first century or tribulation, and that's among dispensationalists, rather than not even looking at what liberals say. So if either of these passages is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in August of AD 70, then we have a problem with Dr. McLean's chronology. At the very heart of his argument, he makes an identification. He says, and I have the quote for you in the paper, and I hope the chart helps a little bit. It's a little difficult to try to visualize this. He says, logic teaches, and then he uses a logic argument that if A equals B and B equals C and C equals D and D equals E, then A equals E. And what he's trying to get to, as you can tell from the chart, if that, according to Daniel 9:27, if the abomination of desolation is at the midpoint, then that has to be identified with Revelation 6:12, 12 to 17, the sixth seal. But all of those boxes have to equal one another in order to get to the proper conclusion. And if anything in that chain falls apart, then you can't get to Revelation 6, make that identification with the sixth seal judgment. His C term is that Luke 21:20 to 24 is a warning of this same time, because it uses that same imagery of woe unto those who are nursing, woe unto those who have infants, that must also refer to the midpoint of the tribulation, when clearly if you exegete the passage on its own, it cannot be referring to the later period, only by application or foreshadow, which is not the same thing. To get this kind of A equals B equals C equals D basis, they all have to be saying the same thing. They have to have the same interpretation, not just application. His D term was to equate Luke 23:29 to 31 to the midpoint as well, and that is also a question. There's just nothing really firm to hang your chronology on in Luke 23:29 to 31. So that calls into question his entire structure. That's the linchpin of his chronology. Dr. Thomas, who does agree and quotes McLean's dissertation extensively in his appendix in his two-volume commentary, writes elsewhere in his hermeneutics book that a fundamental principle in grammatical historical exposition is that the words and sentences can have but one significance in one and the same connection. The moment we neglect this principle, we drift out upon a sea of uncertainty and conjecture. Last year, when we got to the Q&A on Dr. McLean's paper, I asked him the question, how can you say, because he had just admitted that Luke 21 referred to the 70 AD judgment, how can you say that it refers to both? And he replied that that was a double fulfillment. Well, that has been called into question by a number of people in this room, especially Dr. Fruchtenbaum, who I keep quoting. You can pay me later, Arnold. The author does not accept the validity of the principle of double fulfillment. The law states that one passage may have a near and a far view, hence in a way it may be fulfilled twice. Isaiah 7:14 is often used as an example of this view. The near view would be a reference to a child being born in Ahaz's day, but the far view is that of a virgin-born child, which is the birth of the Messiah. This author, however, does not believe that there is such a thing as double fulfillment. A single passage can refer to one thing only, unless stated otherwise. And if it is prophecy, it can have only one fulfillment unless the text itself states that it can have many fulfillments. I looked through Dr. Thomas's book on evangelical hermeneutics to see if he mentioned double fulfillment anywhere. He did not. So I emailed him a couple of days ago and asked him what he thought of this quote from Arnold's book, and he said, well, I agree completely with Arnold. That's why I didn't mention it in my book. So if there is no double fulfillment, and I do not believe that there is, then Dr. McLean's entire chronology seems to fall apart. So that takes us to the next issue that we must address, and that has to do, the next key issue is the measuring that comes in the temple in Revelation chapter 11. Now this is a really fun chapter. This whole section in Revelation to me is just fascinating, and it's not the easiest thing to work through. And I think Revelation 11 is most likely the most important chapter in the apocalypse for determining chronology. And this vignette in Revelation chapter 11 focuses on the temple. And there's a command to the Apostle John to measure the naos, that is the inner sanctum, the holy place. That's the terminology Jesus used in Matthew 24. And so the angel says to John, rise and measure the naos of God, the altar and those who worship there, but leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, For it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread, and uses the same word Jesus used in Matthew 24:15, pateo. They will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. So the question is, when are these 42 months in relation to the abomination of desolation, and what is the significance of this measuring of the temple of God? From my look at available commentaries, it seems that the vast majority of commentators take the 42 months as the second half. They also understand this to be identical with the time of ministry of the two witnesses. In this scenario, the abomination of desolation occurs at the midpoint of the tribulation, which, according to a lunar calendar, would leave exactly 1,260 days, or 42 months, until the end of the period, till the end of the tribulation and the second coming of Christ. The last few months of Daniel's 70th week are the time period of the bowl judgments, a time when all of the salt seas are destroyed and all of the freshwater springs are also destroyed. I think that's significant. How long can people last once something like that has taken place? I think that shows that the bowl judgments cover a much briefer period of time than the seals or trumpets. In 2007, Dr. Whitcomb presented a cogent argument for the witnesses having their ministry in the first half of Daniel's 70th week. His argument is based on several reasons, the most significant of which I summarize here. First, the Lord commanded those who witnessed the abomination of desolation in the middle of Daniel's 70th week that they should immediately flee to the mountains. Whitcomb raises what he calls obvious question: would the two Jewish witnesses remain in Jerusalem during the latter half of the Antichrist reign of terror, since the Lord commanded them to flee to the mountains? I tend to think not. Others have to disagree in order to keep them in Jerusalem during the second half. The second thing Dr. Whitcomb pointed out was if the 1,260 days occur in the last half of the week, then the world would engage in the 3.5-day celebration of the death of the two witnesses after the return of Christ and the consignment of the two beasts and the dragon to their respective punishments. There's more to it than that, as I'll point out. That's just the least of what has to come if those 1,260 days take place in the second half. Third, he correctly recognizes that the Scripture presents the beast reign of terror, that's both the first and second beast, that their reign of terror is being unopposed. How can he, the first beast, bring fire from heaven upon their enemies, Revelation 13:13, when the two witnesses are bringing fire from heaven upon theirs in Revelation 11:5? The only other option would be to make the terms 1,260 days describe a free-floating 3.5-day period which began at some time in the middle of the first half and end sometime in the second half. I heard some people float that after they heard your paper a couple of years ago. Well, maybe that's free-floating. It's neither first half or second half. It's just somewhere in the middle. But the Scriptures seem to be consistent. These terms refer to either first or second half. There's no indication they would refer to some other 3.5-year period. When it comes to understanding the command to measure the temple, there are various options that are given for measuring the temple, whether it refers to protection, whether it refers to some sort of restriction. There's various ideas that are presented. I'm not sure that any of them is necessary. It's necessary to understand any of them in order to see the real point within the passage. Dr. Tony Garland writes, the term that is referring to the naos, the term there refers to the Holy of Holies and the holy place where only the priests were allowed access. The inner sanctuary where the divine being resided is where Jesus predicted the abomination of desolation would one day stand in the holy place, Matthew 24:15. The man of sin, the son of perdition, will also sit in the temple of God, according to 2 Thessalonians 2:4, and this refers to the rebuilt temple, yet future to our time. What this points out is that when you look at this passage, and there's the command to rise and measure the temple of God, it's clear that the Scripture is saying to draw a distinction between what's going on in the inner temple, the inner sanctum, the naos, and what is going on in Jerusalem and the outer courtyard. They're segmented, and what is going on in the outer courtyard is that the Gentiles still tread down the holy city for 42 months. Most people then take that to refer to the second 42 months. However, what I would suggest is that if we look at Luke 21:24 again, where Jesus said, "They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled." The word there is pateo again, which is that is your basic Greek word for walking. Peripateo is a compound, and it just means to walk. Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Only context adds something that might relate to violence, such as trampling. Historically, Jerusalem has not been trampled down, has not been violently controlled by Gentiles. There have been periods of violence, of course, and periods of time when it has been taken in conquest, but for the most part, it's been rather peaceful there. The idea in the figure of speech and the idiom of trampling, or pateo, is simply the idea of control. The Gentiles control the outer courtyard and the outer courtyard and Jerusalem during this time, in contrast to the naos, which is not under their control. Now let me ask the question. When you look at this passage in Revelation 11:1 and 2, and you see this distinction between the Gentiles controlling the outer courtyard in the city, but the inner sanctum is not under their control, how does this comport with 2 Thessalonians 2:4, which states that the Antichrist will sit himself down as God in the naos of God, and later an image of the Antichrist will be placed there for him to be worshipped as God? It seems to me that once he does that, once the abomination of desolation takes place, that from that point on, the Gentiles are not only controlling the city and the outer courtyard, they are now controlling the entire temple complex. And that's what sets the difference. This is so the second half of the tribulation is the period that is after that, the period that is talked about in 11:1 and 2, where only the outer courtyard and the city is under Gentile control, could only refer to the first half of the tribulation period. G.H. Lang observed this over 100 years ago, and he wrote this, that is, the outer courtyard, was not to be included in the survey because it was given to the nations. There is here a notable exactness showing the precise point of time in view so far. The point of time is while the outer court is overrun by Gentiles, but the sanctuary and the altar are as yet unprofaned. But older prophecies make clear that before the end of things, 1, the abomination that maketh desolate, presumably an image of the beast, is to stand in a holy place, Matthew 24:15. And 2, that the beast himself will proceed much further than this in aggression against God, for he will make all sacrifice to God to cease, so that thus the altar also will be profaned. And 3, that he will thrust himself forward into the sanctuary itself, which was in the inner court, and sit there proclaiming himself as the only object of worship, 2 Thess 2:3 and 4. And 4, finally, he will cast down the sanctuary itself, Daniel 8:9 through 14. So when we look at Revelation 11:1 and 2, we should understand this measuring to be distinguishing between these two areas, and that when we read that, we have a little tense issue that are sometimes raised by people in the second verse, but leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given, didomi aorist tense, to the Gentiles. And then the text says, they will tread, this is the future tense of pateo, the holy city underfoot for 42 months. There are some that think that when the angel says this, he's addressing John within the temporal frame of the midpoint of the tribulation, so that the aorist tense refers to the fact that it has been given to the Gentiles in the past, and they will, that is, continue to tread it down for 42 more months. But that's not the only way that this could be understood. In Luke 21:24, the passage in Revelation 11:2 is simply a restatement of Luke 21:24. In the second half of that verse, Jesus said, Jerusalem will be trampled. He uses the future tense of eimi with a periphrastic participle of pateo. And when he says, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. By using the same word pateo in both places, he's saying that this is the normative pattern of Gentile control over the city from at least 70 A.D. until the end of the times of the Gentiles. So when 11:2 comes along and says that it talks about treading the holy city underfoot for 42 months, this isn't verbiage that distinguishes this from the normative Gentile control that's been in effect since at least 70 A.D. It's the same control continuing forward. And if the tense is taken to relate to John's writing time, then there's no problem. He's simply making, it can be understood to be simply a statement. It has been given, that is by God, to the Gentiles, and they will tread. This is just a summary repetition of what Jesus said in Luke 21:24. They will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months, and that has to refer to the first half because the second half has the image of the beast within the city. Tony Garland recognizes the issues here in his commentary on Revelation. He writes, the treading of the holy city is said to last 42 months. This corresponds to half of the final week of the 70 days of Daniel. But which half? John is told not to measure the outer court because it has been given, aorist tense, typically an event occurring prior to the time of the writer, to the Gentiles. Then John is told they will tread, future tense, the holy city for 42 months. If the treading of the holy city by the Gentiles is taken to be simultaneous with their authority over the outer court, then it occurs while the Jews are allowed to worship in the temple and sacrifice on the altar. That is the position that I take. This would be the first half of the final week before sacrifices are brought to an end and the two witnesses are overcome by the beast. If the treading is taken to follow the possession of the outer court by the Gentiles, then the 42 months could denote the last half of the week. This is the position that would put the trumpets and the witnesses in the second half. It says, after the Antichrist has violated his covenant, in Daniel 9:27, the abomination of desolation occurs. The Antichrist exerts his global authority, and the Jews flee to the wilderness where they are protected by God. He goes on to relate that to the times of the Gentiles in Luke 21:24. But there's a couple of other chronological notations within the structure of Revelation 11 that must be taken into account as well. And the next is in verse 7 of chapter 11. When they finish the testimony, we read that the beast that ascends out of the abyss will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. So this is very clear that they are killed by this individual referred to as the beast that ascends out of the abyss. But if you're reading through the book of Revelation, from Revelation 1 through 22 in its standard order, when you get to Revelation 11:7, you haven't been introduced to the beasts of Revelation 13 yet, or Revelation 17. The only thing you know of coming out of the abyss is Abaddon, the king of the demons that have been confined in the abyss. So the question that occurred to me, is this referring to that individual? But most dispensationalists, most writers, will go to Revelation 17:8, a later passage, to define their understanding of the beast in Revelation 11. Revelation 17:8 says, the beast that you saw was and is not and will ascend out of the abyss and go to perdition. Same phraseology. Now, this beast that is referred to there is the beast that is ridden by the woman in Revelation 17:1-5, and there is the comparison of that beast with the 7 heads and the 10 horns, with the kingdom of the Antichrist at the end time, and you get this correlation between the king and the kingdom, as well as the dragon who has the 7 horns and 10 heads. So all of these things are correlated to make sure we understand them and identify them with the kingdom of the Antichrist, Babylon the Great. Now in Revelation 13:1, John says that he stood on the sand of the sea, and he saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. So this would be, is this the beast out of the abyss, or is it a reference back to Abaddon and Revelation 9:11? Well, after going through that, I think that the only reason I mention this is because if it is the beast in Revelation 9:11, that's the fifth trumpet judgment, so that gives us a chronological marker. But I think that we have a better chronological marker if we understand, go along with what Dr. Thomas says in relationship to this passage. As you look at Revelation 11:7 down through 14, I'll just hit the high points. When they finish their testimony, the end of the two witnesses, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. Their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. Notice in verse 1 it was called Holy Jerusalem. Even though it's still a holy city, at the same time it's referred to as Sodom and Egypt. So it is apostate. At that time, their bodies are laid out. 3 days later, they are resurrected and taken to heaven. And at that same time, in verse 13, we read, there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell. And in the earthquake, 7,000 people were killed, and the rest were afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven. I think that is significant. I think if this is the midpoint of the tribulation, this is when we see a huge number of Israel-based Jews turning to accept Jesus as Messiah, and then hearing that they have to flee into the wilderness. But we have a chronological marker in the next verse. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. Now that word quickly is the Greek word taku, which doesn't necessarily mean it's coming immediately, but when it comes, it will come rapidly. And I think that there are some things that are going to take place before the third woe unfolds, which is the seventh trumpet. And before that, you have the seven thunders that take place. But when the bowl judgments come, that's the third woe, they will come very rapidly. It will look something like this. The seals and trumpets in the first half, then the abomination of desolation. You have the two witnesses in the first half, then they are taken to heaven. You have the Antichrist take his seat in the Holy of Holies. He has already had the fatal wound and been resurrected, and he has been brought back to life. That phraseology that's used in Revelation chapter 17, talking about that he was and he is to come, identifying the beast, would indicate that resurrection he comes out of the abyss. Now, if you look at this chronology and you say that the trumpets have to come after the abomination of desolation, and the sixth trumpet is the second woe, and that's when the two witnesses are killed. They're killed 42 months or 1,260 days after the abomination of desolation. That comes right at the end of the tribulation. So the seven trumpets have to go almost to the very end. Actually, they have to go to the very end if you're really going to take 1,260 days precisely. And see, you can't even tell up there, but you've had to scrunch the thunders and the bowl judgments into almost the last day in order for the chronology to fit. Now, when we look at Revelation 17, 7, 8, and 11, the angel says to John, "Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel when they see the beast that was and is not, and yet is. The beast that was and is not, and is himself also the 8th, and his other 7, is going to perdition." Now, this is a very difficult passage to think your way through and work through. Seems very confusing because of the deep interconnections that occur between the beast and the king and the kingdom, and the interchange and identification of these various terms. But Dr. Thomas gives us a lot of help with this, working our way through this confusion. He writes, "The beast is the empire, or more particularly the ruler who perfectly embodies the spirit of the empire. He goes on to say, in each of his appearances in this book, the beast is either an empire or the ruler of that empire. Each head of the beast is a partial incarnation of satanic power that rules for a given period. So the beast can exist on earth without interruption in the form of 7 consecutive kingdoms, but he can also be non-existent at a given moment in the form of one of an empire's kings. The non-existent beast in verse 8 must therefore be a temporarily absent king over the empire that will exist in the future. So this helps us work our way through the details. Even though at first blush it may seem that the fatal wound to one of the heads at the beginning of Revelation 13 is a wound to a kingdom, it becomes clear in Revelation 13:12 through 15 that it indicates an individual is in view and not a kingdom. The same becomes true in chapter 17. By the time you get to the middle of the chapter, an individual is clearly in view. Initially, the beast the woman rides appears to be a kingdom or the different manifestation of the kingdom of man through the ages, but the description of the beast who was and is not and is about to come out of the abyss relates more to an individual than a kingdom. Again, Dr. Thomas helps us with this. He draws the important connection between the is and is not state and the fatal wound of the beast in Revelation 13:3, 12, and 14. He writes, the words is not referred to the beast's death, and his ascent from the abyss means he will come to life again. This is the same as his reappearance as an 8th king in 1711. This is his career midpoint, i.e. a time at the very beginning of chapter 13 when he comes up out of the sea. This is most probably a point at the very middle of the 70th week between the beast's human and superhuman careers. Now, if that marks the midpoint, then when Revelation 11:7 says that the beast who ascends out of the abyss kills the 2 witnesses, the ascending out of the abyss is his resurrection after the fatal head wound, and that connects those events together as the midpoint of the tribulation, which ends the second woe or the 6th trumpet judgment. Thomas also writes that when he does ascend from the abyss, he will come back in a demonic rather than a purely human form to establish his world domination. This explains why the abyss, the abode of demons, is his origin. So this brings our connections together within the text itself. Now, when we look at just the overall structure of Revelation, a couple of observations are in order. There seems to be a general chronological flow. We have the seal judgments, we have the trumpet judgments, then we have this intercalation period between Revelation chapter 10 to 14, which deals with certain key people and key events, which seems to take us back to what has already been said and sort of bring us up to date with other things that are going on other than the seal and the trumpet judgments. And the focal point of 12, 13, and 14 is on the rise of the Antichrist to the point of chasing the woman, who is Israel, into the wilderness and persecuting her. Now, if those chapters are fundamentally talking about focusing on bringing us to a point of the midpoint of the tribulation, which almost everybody agrees on, my question is, why do they come after the trumpet judgments if indeed they are to come between the seal and trumpet judgments, as the other view argues? It seems to me that in the chronological flow of Revelation, you have seal judgments, trumpet judgments, passages that focus on the midpoint events of the tribulation, and then the bowl judgments. And so that fits that pattern. So the chart that I have up on the screen would be the view that the intercalation periods actually come after the chronological sections. To just explain that, the bottom line are your seal judgments, trumpet judgments, and bowl judgments. Each of those go 1 through 6, or 1 through 7, 1 through 7, 1 through 7. That's clear chronology. But how do the other chapters fit? Do they after, or are they at the same time? In the view that the trumpet judgments keep cutting out, so just when I turn, or in the view that the trumpet judgments come in the second half, that goes along with making the seal judgments come, the 144,000 being sealed, that comes after the seal judgments. The events in chapters 10 through 14 would come after, some a little bit identified with the sixth or the second woe, but mostly coming after. Then you have the bowl judgments, and then the destruction of Babylon would have to come after that. However, if you look at this and you think about it, it became very clear to me that the two chapters that deal with the destruction of Babylon, chapters 17 and 18, are really going back to the last verses of chapter 16 to give us more detail, a more detailed look at that destruction of Babylon in the sixth bowl judgment. That is just like what I said earlier in terms of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, in terms of you getting the overview of the bowl judgments and then coming back and focusing on one narrow aspect. If that is John's pattern, then what John is doing is he's giving us a chronology, and then he focuses on some element or elements within that chronology, and so that the intercalation periods are just recapitulations of other events that happened during the period of the previous set of judgments, so that the 144,000 sealed would take place during the time of the seal judgments. The period of the two witnesses, the picture of the war in heaven, which culminates with the Satan being cast out, which occurs at the midpoint of the tribulation, I believe, and persecuting the woman into the desert. That takes place, it goes all the way back to the birth of Messiah the Son, and brings us all the way up to date to just after the midpoint of the tribulation. Then you have the seven thunders, which aren't written down, and then the bowl judgments are described with a more detailed look of the description or the destruction of Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18. So that our final chronological chart looks like this. The seven seal judgments and trumpet judgments are in the first half. The two witnesses are in the first half. The abomination of desolation takes place after the beast has been resurrected from his apparently fatal head wound. He goes to the abyss. He comes back with supercharged demonic powers, sets himself up as God. This is comparable to the sixth trumpet judgment or the second woe. Following this, you have the Satan, the demons at about that time are cast out of heaven to the earth. They persecute the woman, the remnant into the wilderness. This is the same period that you have the seven thunder judgments, and then the last 3.5 years end up with, the last part of the second 3.5 years ends up with the bowl judgments. In conclusion, the purpose of this paper has been to evaluate evidence set forth by those who place the trumpet judgments in the first half of Daniel's 70th week and those who place the trumpet judgments in the second half. Though no definitive passage has been found, it has been argued that the chronological crux is found in Revelation 11, which indicates the great difficulty of having both the two witnesses and the trumpet judgments in the second half. Since the second woe ends with the ascension of the two witnesses, and since the two witnesses serve for 1,260 days, it is not possible for this to take place in the second half of the tribulation period. Therefore, the view with the least problems places the two witnesses and the trumpet judgments in the first half of Daniel's 70th week. How am I doing on time? Did I leave time for questions?
Yeah.
Oh, my mistake.
Yeah. So, Dr. LaHaye, it's good to know that he confirmed the scheme that we have in the Tim LaHaye Prophecy Study Bible. Amen. Okay. Those of you that may have questions, question away. Go ahead. First one over here.